Today, I'm very delighted to introduce Dr. Massa as our speaker. Just a very brief introduction and to not steal any more of her time. Dr. Massa received her doctorate degree in plant biology at Penn State and has gone on to become a NASA scientist working in crop production at the ISS, among other things. She's also active in outreach programs and related everything to plants in space. Please hold on to your questions until the end of the presentation. Just raise your hand and I will call on you on a first come, first served basis. Feel also free to send the questions through the chat if you're more comfortable with that, and I will ask them at the end of the presentation. Now, everyone, please welcome Dr. Massa.
Thank you, Alenka, and thank you everybody for coming today. It's wonderful to be back, at Penn State, even virtually. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about, what my job is, how I got here, and also why I'm doing what I'm doing and what I'm actually doing. So I guess kind of my journey to start. I was born in South Florida. So I'm a Floridian, and I grew up in Central Florida, about an hour and a half from where I'm at now. And while there, I got involved in agriculture. I was in the FFA organization, and even starting in 7th grade. So when I was 12 years old, I had an agriculture teacher who got invited to Kennedy Space Center to learn about the research that was going on. And, when I talk with teachers, it really, I can't tell them how important some of these early experiences are in shaping people's career paths. So for me, that experience where my teacher came to Kennedy Space Center, learned about the research, and then brought back, something like 40 hours of video and information about all the work that was being done. I just sat there and I was completely enthralled. I'd always liked science. I'd liked, agriculture. I liked animals, but I knew I didn't want to work with them. But this really gave me my path and set me on my trail. And I continued taking agriculture classes in middle school and high school. And I also conducted, research, agricultural sciences research. So I built hydroponic systems. I killed lots of plants in my hydroponic systems, as one does. And I wrote a letter in high school to Kennedy Space Center, talking about some of the problems that I was having. And, I got a wonderful response back from someone that I now work with. So those types of interactions also are really influential and impactful. So I went to Cornell for undergraduate for plant sciences. I knew I wanted to do plants, and there I worked in a laboratory, plant hormone laboratory. So I was doing much more kind of fundamental plant physiology. I had an opportunity to study abroad, and I went to the University of Tasmania in Australia, where my undergraduate advisor had a close collaborator. There I got to learn about all the crazy Australian plants and do more plant physiology, also a lot of plant evolution, ecological genetics, just some really amazing experiences there. And so then I came back and, I had an internship as an undergraduate, a senior year, right before senior year, or right after senior year at Kennedy Space Center. And it helped to kind of re-cement me on the path that I wanted to do plants in space. I tend to think of some of these opportunities as like the kind of the plus ups in Super Mario Brothers or something, where you just sort of get bumped up and continue on your level. So when I was looking for graduate schools, I interviewed in a number of schools. I ended up at Penn State in the laboratory of Professor Simon Gilroy, who sadly is no longer there. He's at the University of Wisconsin now, but at the time he was just starting young faculty at Penn State. And he was working on space-related research and cell signaling. So I did my PhD on plant cell signaling, the interaction of gravity and touch in roots, so mechanical and gravitational forces and how this impacted root growth. I realized after many hours sitting in, very cold North Freer at the time, staring down, a dark microscope, that really wasn't my happy place. While I love the ideas and I loved, learning about it, I really was more interested on plants as a whole organism and on plants as a food source. And so for me, I realized during graduate school that the fundamental side of biology wasn't as interesting to me as the applied side of the agricultural science side. So really the food production and the crop production. So I went to Purdue following my time at Penn State, and I did a postdoc in a NASA-funded center. I made connections at national conferences in gravitational and space research, space biology, where I met the professor that I worked with at Purdue, Carrie Mitchell, who is in the horticulture and landscape architecture department there. And he was the director of a NASA center that was interdisciplinary. So it was agriculture and engineering and food science and, all different areas within those more kind of applied aspects. So civil, environmental, electrical, mechanical engineering, horticulture, agronomy, food science, ag and bioengineering. And so this NASA center was specifically focused on advanced life support, or what's called bioregenerative life support, using biology to support the crew. So that includes plants for crop production, but it also includes things like water recycling, atmosphere revitalization, using things like bioreactors, waste processing to recover resources, and closing those loops, as well as things like systems engineering, which is something, that I hadn't really thought about, but it's basically integration and putting all of this together and planning and scheduling. And this was a wonderful experience. I worked with a lot of different people in a lot of different fields, and I found myself very comfortable in this environment. I was very comfortable growing larger crop plants, things that I could kind of explain to my mom and my grandma what I was doing and why, which I didn't feel I got from the cell biology work that I had done previously. So I really enjoyed that interaction, and I enjoyed being able to just talk to a lot of different people, learning how to speak to engineers, as a scientist. I also really liked building things. I liked designing my experiments and building the hardware to support them, and working with engineers and mechanical designers to help make that happen. And I liked growing plants in greenhouses and growth chambers, big plants, as opposed to, working with 3-day-old Arabidopsis, which is what I did my PhD mostly on. So that really brought me back to my roots for my agricultural interests. And while there, I made a lot of other connections in terms of people in the space, field, space industry. We had NASA advisors for this NASA center, so that when an opportunity at Kennedy Space Center opened up, where I had wanted to always come back after being an intern, I also had a student spaceflight experiment while at Penn State. So those little plus ups, but I wanted to come back, and I wanted to work with the group here, and an opportunity opened up as a postdoc. By that time, I'd been a postdoc at Penn State for a while. I transferred to being a research scientist at Penn State because we had big recession and all the jobs dried up. I had interviewed for a number of faculty and industry jobs, but they just really weren't either things that I wanted, or things kind of fell through, or things were a little dodgy. The economy was very, very weird at that time. And so I had this opportunity to do a postdoc at Kennedy Space Center in the NASA postdoctoral program. So I didn't really want to be a postdoc anymore. I was kind of tired of being on soft money, but I really wanted to be here. So my husband and I took a gamble, and we moved down here. I met my husband at Purdue, and he got his PhD there in literature, and he now works for a local university here. And I came as a NASA postdoc, and then after a few years, an opportunity to be a NASA project scientist opened up, and I was able to to apply and get that. So I'll talk a little more about what that means at the end of this, but I'm going to talk a bit about what I do and what I've done here. So first of all, the team, this is very much a teamwork effort. We work on the advanced plant habitat. You can see the logo in the top left, and the Veggie system. These are both hardware that we have in our space flight on the International Space Station. But this is just a few of the members of our team. We have scientists, we have engineers, we have people from all different fields: microbiology, molecular biology, chemistry, mechanical engineering, chemical engineering, etc. We have postdocs, we have interns, and then we have contractor scientists and civil servant scientists and engineers. But nobody can do this work alone. There's a lot more people involved than just shown here. These are some of the key people that are part of our team. But teamwork is one of NASA's core values, and it's something that I just can't reiterate enough. So, why we're growing plants in space. I love this photo of astronaut Mike Hopkins on one of his earlier space station missions. He's showing a Thanksgiving dinner, and all the food is individually wrapped, prepackaged. It's actually quite good. There's a couple of hundred different food items. However, if you store that food for long durations, the vitamins break down and the quality breaks down. So we're looking now kind of, I talked about how we did a lot of work on bioregenerative life support and supporting the crew with plants and biology. But right now we're really focused on supplementing this packaged diet for more near-term missions. At the same time, when you're growing plants for food, they may provide psychological benefit, and we're working on capturing those data. And they recycle the atmosphere. They take up the carbon dioxide, they give off oxygen. They also do help recycle the water, and you can capture the water vapor coming out of plants as totally pure water. So there's a lot of roles for them now and in the future. And this is like an artist concept of what a future lunar base might look like. And you'll see there densely packed plants growing under electric lights, in the habitat with the crew. We're growing plants like this on Earth today. These were taken by my colleague Ray Wheeler in the Osaka Prefecture University vertical farm training facility. So these types of plant factories and vertical farming, it's becoming more and more common terrestrially, but it's the same way that we're thinking about growing plants for space. Very dense, packed plants under electric lights inside. And more and more this type of controlled environment agricultural production is getting economically viable all over the world, especially in urban areas. In a near-term scenario, it might be like my background here, a plant growth chamber that could launch on a rocket and hook to a habitat that could provide supplemental produce for a crew that's there on a short duration. This one's on Mars, it could be on the moon. But we already do this type of thing on Earth today as well. This is a photo of the South Pole greenhouse at the US Antarctic Station, where they provide fresh produce to crews overwintering in Antarctica. And one of my colleagues is currently at the German Neumayer station in Antarctica, and she's been managing this Eden ISS facility, which is a plant growth module that was essentially a shipping container brought to Antarctica to grow food for the crew. She's been there the entire year overwintering in Antarctica, collecting data on growth of crops and how they can integrate with humans in these, isolated in extreme environments. So that's been a very successful experiment. And Jess was actually a Penn State grad as well. So she was an intern with me at Kennedy Space Center right after she completed her master's in weed science at Penn State. And then, she became one of our contractor scientists, and now she's in Antarctica. So interesting path to go from a weed scientist to, an Antarctic scientist. She'll be starting her PhD soon as well. So our space crop production group has a goal of ensuring food system security on long duration missions beyond low Earth orbit. And food security here is the condition in which the crew have continuous access to sufficient safe and nutritious food, which meets both their dietary needs and their food preferences, because if they don't like it, they're not going to eat it, in order to maintain their peak health and performance. And so in the near term, we're looking, as I said, at nutrient supplementation of the packaged diet. But in the long term, we're going to start to replace the calories and facilitate Earth independence. And so that's where we'll have larger volumes of the plants. We'll be able to grow more of those staple crops. And that will start to help replenish more of the atmosphere and other aspects of the bioregenerative life support. So that sort of depicts this pictorially. Right now, we're looking on the left-hand side of the chart at pick and eat crops that can be grown and consumed without processing. So your salad crops and your herbs. We don't have any way to cook anything on space station, and we probably won't in the earlier missions. But then later on, if we have, say, a microwave or an oven, we can easily add potatoes or sweet potatoes to the diet. They're very high calorie, they're very productive. All you need is a way to cook them. Things like wheat and soybean require more processing equipment and probably more automation. So you have your threshing and your milling, and then your bread machines and tofu presses, et cetera. So that's a little farther downstream. And we work with the environmental cardinal factors of plant growth, light, temperature, moisture, nutrients, and atmosphere. But these change in a space environment. So we have to work to understand how these different environmental factors change when we're designing hardware and when we're growing crops in space. Lack of convection, the behavior of fluids, et cetera. Some of the things like light are pretty much the same as on Earth. We're learning, but we didn't know until we started testing this. Other things, are very different. And getting water and air to the roots of crops has been a huge challenge for us because water and air behave so strangely without gravity. And when we go to the moon or Mars, we're going to have some gravity, but we still don't quite know how much is enough. So one of the aspects of my job is working with people that understand these things. So I work pretty closely with the microgravity fluid physicists up at Glenn Research Station. They work on fluid physics originally for things like how to deliver liquid fuel to a rocket motor without gravity. But now they're helping us figure out how we can water our plants and get oxygen in the root zone. And so establishing some of these collaborations has been a really important part of my job, because these are big questions, and people in individual fields can't solve them. You need to pull in from a lot of different fields to be able to solve some of these challenges. So we have a lot of challenges in terms of space crop production. Some are very specific to deep space, like the microgravity, the lack of convection and fluid movement. Some are kind of surface specific, like dust on the moon or Mars, which is very challenging, partial gravity. Some are kind of shared, like the increased radiation, reduced pressure, hazards of micrometeorites. Then we have some crop-specific challenges, which are the same as for any terrestrial agricultural system. How do you get productivity with all these stresses? How do you optimize for your environment? How do you schedule? And then some that are kind of unique. We want to grow very compact plants. We have a very high CO2 environment. We have a lot of specific food safety concerns, and we have a closed microbiome ecosystem with humans transferring their human-associated microbes to the plants and back and forth in a high radiation environment, which may cause increased mutations. We need certain nutrients to supplement the packaged diet, and we're trying to do all this sustainably with all these really unique abiotic stresses and a lot of limitations in resources and crew time. So we're doing a lot of work now on the International Space Station, but we're going to be working, we work a lot on the ground, and we're translating into other environments as well, looking at lunar, transit to Mars, the Mars surface, the lunar surface, et cetera. So for the ISS, we've been working in a small plant growth chamber called Veggie, which looks like this. It's about the size of a 2-drawer filing cabinet. And so as a NASA postdoc, I came to Kennedy Space Center to plan the first missions of Veggie and to figure out what to grow and how to grow it, doing kind of plant horticultural optimization in this hardware, because it had never been used in spaceflight before. They didn't even have the flight hardware. We only had prototype hardware. And so I worked to test different plant types, different growing systems, different substrates, fertilizers, and ways to grow them, horticultural methods. And I developed a proposal for the initial test of the Veggie hardware, which was our Veg-01 experiment. So we had 3 sets of plants that we sent in Veg-01, 2 sets of a red romaine lettuce, and 1 set of zinnia flowers, because we couldn't allow the crew to eat the first set of lettuce. We needed to bring it back to do food safety analysis and assess, whether it was okay for them to eat. So we also wanted to send something non-edible that they could grow in the meantime if they wanted to grow something in between the first and second set of lettuce, and depending on how long it took us to get approval for the crew to eat them. So I was hired on as this process and preparation for the Veg-01 flight developed, and I was able to continue that work as the science lead for this first flight of Veggie as a NASA civil servant. So I was hired out of the postdoctoral program into that role. And this was the very first test of Veggie. And as you see here, we had some decent looking red romaine lettuce, but we only had 3 of our 6 plants. So we had a lot of attrition. But when, baseball terms, we batted 500. We learned a lot from this, and really the main key here was the watering system was not able to meet the needs of the plants. So these plants on the end here actually died. They had germinated, but they died, and one of the ones in the back didn't ever germinate. So we learned a lot. We learned that the system had to be much more manually controlled and monitored, because Veggie is a very simple, low power system, and the water via wicking that was planned just didn't work as planned. But we got good samples back. We got decent food safety. We worked through all the approval boards. NASA has a lot of boards, a lot of safety. Safety is another one of our core values. And we got approval for the crew to grow and eat the second set of lettuce. And that's what this video shows, the harvest of that. That's astronaut Kjell Lundgren harvesting the second set. And here we had 5 of 6 plant pillows, which are our little grow bags, grow crops. The one in the back left failed to hydrate. So we had a hardware malfunction, and the biology therefore wasn't able to grow. But we got approval for the crew to eat half the produce. We brought the other half back to, again, do food safety and nutritional analysis. And we've always been doing that since this first test to try to, understand how this ecosystem is changing over time, to understand the microbiome of these crops, and just to see, will they be safe to eat when growing in this unique environment. So here you can see this was on NASA TV. It was a big deal. They had a lettuce toast with the astronauts eating the first lettuce that came out of the Veggie hardware. So this was a super big deal. This was very exciting. We actually ended up getting to grow that variety of lettuce at the White House in their kitchen garden. I got to go and meet the First Lady and help plant some crops in that garden. We got tremendous publicity from this because it was really a good story and a good news. We grew the other crop, the zinnias, after this. Oh, first, yeah, the astronauts made some speeches. They talked about the importance of the crops, the psychological benefit, and also, how we need to be more self-sustainable for our food supply. So it was impactful for them as well. And just hearing from them these things that we'd been thinking about was very important to our team. So we grew the zinnias next. They wanted to continue to grow things. And this was also pretty good. It was kind of a roller coaster of an experiment. We had a lot of problems with the hardware. We lost airflow. We ended up getting fungus. We lost a lot of the plants. but some of the plants survived. And when they started blooming, it was kind of a game changer. It went from being this dramatic, stressful, kind of really, really rough experience to being great. And here you see some of the shots when astronaut Scott Kelly took the zinnia out of the Veggie unit and took pictures of it all over our space station. You know, it was a really, really big deal. He talks about quite a lot in his book that he wrote about his spaceflight experiences. We had a variety of zinnia that I selected called profusion zinnia, which just had a lot of flowers. So you see here, we only have 2 plants, but they had a lot of flowers. So it ended up going from kind of a, you know, tragedy to success, which, as we all know, is not uncommon in science, but often it's the other way around. So this was nice when it actually was successful. And it was really a lot of hard work by the astronauts to get us to this point. Here you can see him harvesting. We were doing microbial swabbing as well. He asked if he could make a bouquet, which ties into what I was saying about the psychological benefits. He took photos of this bouquet, which you'll see later. This harvest was on Valentine's Day, which he specifically requested to do, which was his day off. It was a Sunday. And we got samples back, and we were able to germinate the next set of plants from some of the seeds from this grow out, which was another kind of surprising success, since we didn't have active pollination or anything. So after that, we've grown more leafy crops. We did red romaine lettuce. We look at other horticultural techniques. So multiple cropping, cut and come again here. Peggy Whitson was doing it also with another crop, Chinese cabbage. We had some interesting plant physiology results from this crop. It did not like the high carbon dioxide levels of space station. So we learned from that. And we had some follow-on research on that crop. We sent a second Veggie unit, did multiple cropping together. Here's Scott Tingle showing off a variety of crops in both veggies, looking at, could we do more of a continuous harvest scenario? So if we stagger the growth of these and we harvest it every 3 or 4 days, how long can we keep things going, and how much salad could be produced? We sent new crops, looking at nutrition and growth. We do a lot of crop screening on the ground. So red Russian kale, dragoon lettuce, wasabi mustard, extra dwarf pak choi, and amara mustard were sent, as long with outrageous lettuce. They were grown in different combinations. Recently, the extra dwarf pak choi and the amara mustard, so actually not that recently, it was about a year ago, were grown, well, 6 months to a year ago. And 2 of these varieties were student selected crops. So as Alenka mentioned, one of my big parts of my job is outreach and education. And we have developed as part of this a program for middle schools and high schools, where we have right now 300 schools around the country testing new crops for space. They get all the hardware, and they run experiments and they collect data, and it's basically a citizen science kind of crowdsourced approach to identifying new good candidate crops. Because if a crop can grow well in, say, 50 different schools where some students are overwatering, some are underwatering, we have some schools with air conditioning, some with not, some at high altitudes in like Denver, some in Puerto Rico at sea level. If we have all these different variables and we still have crops that consistently do well, they may be good candidates for space. So we've been really successful with this program. It's been running for 6 years now. It's been an absolute joy to work with the teachers and students. We've been growing the program every year. It's called Growing Beyond Earth. And 2 of these varieties now have been grown and tested in spaceflight. And the students have also done things like had conversations with astronauts on orbit and with a downlink. And they do original research as well. So they do the same thing that all the schools do kind of in the fall, and then they're able to write research proposals, which get assessed. We recently reviewed them, and then in the spring, they conduct original research based on what they did in the fall. So students are getting experience as scientists in a very young age, And they're getting excited because they're doing authentic research, not just, what's out of the back of the textbook. So we don't know the answers, and that's really, really wonderful for them. And we also interact with them in a variety of different ways. So we're really fortunate to have partners at Fairchild Tropical Botanic Gardens in Miami to conduct this, and we work closely with them for this program. So Veggie 4 was the result of my first PI grant. So part of my job was doing these earlier experiments, which were more tech demos, validating the hardware. I wrote proposals, but they were all kind of internally assessed. This was a competitive peer-reviewed grant where we had research to study the lighting of crop growth, nutrient composition of those crops under different spectra of light, the organoleptic acceptability. So we have the astronauts doing taste tests on orbit, and the microbial food safety. And then we're also have, as part of our team, behavioral health psychologists who are assessing how plants impact crew well-being and behavioral health. So again, this is part of collaboration. We had outside investigators. So we had a company, SNC Orbitech, which is now Sierra Space. We have Purdue University and Kennedy Space Center and Johnson Space Center as part of this. So this is actually a couple sets of experiments. The Veggie 4 was doing this with Mizuna mustard, which is one of our leafy green varieties. And then Veggie 5 will do this with dwarf tomatoes. So we're kind of still in the process of this grant. But this was pretty exciting. We had a lot of crew involvement, because we wanted a lot of different astronauts involved in taking care of the plants and, of course, eating the plants, as you can see here. You can see they get everything out on their table to try with the plants. They mix the plants in all different things. We had great feedback from the astronauts on this experiment, and that really helps to shape what we do in the future. We've also heard from the crew how much the aroma, the sensory aspect of smelling the plants really impacts them living in this isolated environment. And we got some great photos to capture that. They said it's kind of like being in the produce aisle of a grocery store. Recently on Space Station, this is an experiment in a different piece of hardware. I mentioned the advanced plant habitat. So veggies are very simple hardware. This is our advanced plant habitat, which is got about 180 sensors and control systems for different aspects of the environment. It has a lot of cameras. It has, things like soil moisture sensors, leaf temperature sensors, etc. It's a lot more challenging. It's a lot more power intensive, but it's really our plant physiology research tool. And as a postdoc, I got to help define the science requirements for this while this hardware was being built. Now it's on orbit, and we've had a couple of experiments in there. This was the PH02 experiment with radishes. We've had experiments with Arabidopsis. Right now there is cotton growing in this hardware on Petri dishes. And so we're learning a lot from this. I've recently received another grant to do work in this hardware. We're going to be testing the impact of the root zone moisture on the crop microbiome for lettuce. And so even though you can't quite tell, there's actually 4 separate quadrants in this hardware that can be controlled individually. So we're going to have 4 different water treatments in here, and we'll be able to look at how that impacts plant growth, nutrient content, and then the microbiome of those crops to figure out what's the best way to fail. Is it better to have too much water, not enough water? Obviously you really want to be ideal with your watering, but that can be hard. So we're really excited to be working on that. Another veggie experiment was, we had some very old seeds, plant pillows up there of mixed crop, and some of them didn't germinate very well. So the astronaut tried to transplant some of the ones that did germinate well. And you can look in that picture on the left, which is a small seedling that he removed at about 10 days. And the very little root got removed. Most of the root broke off. on Earth, that probably wouldn't survive very well. But this is one case where the fluid physics of this environment actually worked in our favor, and he was able to successfully transplant. That's an extra dwarf pak choi, so one of those student selected crops. And you can see there, there's the transplant on the far right, and the original that was in the same plant pillow with it on the left. So it didn't do quite as well, but it actually did pretty darn well. And we were delighted that this process worked in space. So sometimes we have these kind of happy accidents where we can learn a lot. Another thing that we tested, this was last year as well, was a way to handle the seeds. So handling seeds in microgravity is hard, planting is hard, but ultimately we want the crew to be able to plant what they want to grow. And so our colleagues developed this seed film, which is a water-soluble, food-safe polymer with the seeds embedded in it. You could also add things like fertilizers, stabilized microbes, even hormones or growth regulators to this. We just tested just seeds and lettuce, but it actually did extremely well on orbit. So that was super successful. And then recently we've been involved with the space chilies. So these are back in the advanced plant habitat, not veggie. This was a ground test before flight. So my colleagues tested a lot of different chili pepper varieties. They settled on this Espanola improved hatch chili pepper. And this launched in July through November of last year, and gave the astronauts the chance to answer the red or green question. So they actually grew pretty well. We had some interesting morphology. Normally these flowers on the ground are kind of pendant, hang down on space. They were sort of pointing up, and we got peppers kind of pointing out straight up, shooting off like rockets. But the peppers did really well. And so we had really successful growth on the ISS. These are all photos from the ISS. You can see these little blue trellises here. They had to kind of prop up and trellis them. And here are the astronauts harvesting some of the peppers in November. So this was a pretty exciting, high profile experiment. And I was not the lead for this. I was peripherally involved, but it's all sort of meeting our crop goals, and I was helping to advise this team. So we're, as I said, working next on dwarf tomatoes. These are a shot of some of the dwarf tomatoes that we grew in veggie. We're growing some more right now, and hopefully those will be up next from our team. And so we're excited, though it's taken quite a while to get these to grow. There are a few challenges. So back to my job, so I'm technically what's called a life sciences project scientist. I was hired by NASA in 2013. In 2016, I applied for a senior project scientist job, 2017 maybe. I don't know, it all runs together. But now I'm technically a senior life sciences project scientist. And so it varies every day. I spend a lot of time in meetings. We're the government, we have a lot of meetings. One of the things that I do is conduct strategic planning. So I work with our space crop production project manager and others of our project team to figure out what needs to be done when, what are our gaps, what are our challenges to getting successful crop production. The things that I just mentioned are really proof of concept, very early stage, not very efficient, not very sustainable. So how do we get to the next step? So we do a lot of planning for that and figuring out what types of experiments, what types of grants, what types of contracts need to be developed to get us to the next step. I conduct research, both ground and flight research. So I'm the PI on a number of grants, as well as internal proposals. NASA has some internal smaller proposals for research and technology development. So I write a lot of proposals, which is a really good skill to develop as a graduate student. You need to do it from postdocs on, and it certainly will always serve you well. I worked at Purdue while I was a postdoc, helping Carrie Mitchell, the faculty I worked with, write proposals. And Purdue had, which I'm sure Penn State does as well, proposal coordinators that when faculty were writing for big grants, they could use this service of the university of someone to help coordinate the proposal. And I kind of shadowed that person as we were doing some big USDA grants. I really learned a lot. I made every advantage of that opportunity to understand how a good proposal is drafted. So if you see any opportunities like that, or if you can seek out opportunities like that to learn about proposal development and work with professional proposal coordinators, I urge you to take advantage of that. It's really eye-opening. And it tells you how to manage teams, how to manage the sections of the proposal. And I think it probably would have been really useful for writing up my thesis as well, because a lot of the lessons that learned, would apply to that. So I do lead research. I also participate in research. I'm a PI or a co-I. Some of the research is at Kennedy Space Center, some is elsewhere. We have different collaborative research. We're actually going to be starting a big project at Johnson Space Center where we have people in a contained environment, and we'll be leading the crop side of adding crops to the people in this environment in the simulated Mars mission. So we're really excited about that. That'll be 3 one-year missions. I also, a big part of my job is to act as a project scientist, which means I support other external PIs in the development of their research. So if you are a scientist at Penn State, you write a NASA grant and you get a flight proposal funded to do an experiment on the International Space Station, or you get a ground proposal, I would be involved as your contracting officer representative. That's what CORE stands for here in the second part of that bullet, and project scientist for your mission, or one of my colleagues would. And so we would work with you to develop, especially for flight experiments. For ground, you have a lot of leeway, and we just help out if you have any questions or make sure your grant gets funded. But for flight experiments, we work with you to work through the flight development process, which involves verification of your science and our hardware, kind of dress rehearsal testing for flight, and then development of success criteria and preparation for flight. So I kind of act as the science liaison with the hardware and the payload development team. And I'm kind of the advocate for the science, but I also represent your science up at NASA headquarters, where the funding comes from for space biology. When we have new hardware developed, I help develop the science requirements for that. So I mentioned I did that in advanced plant habitat. We're doing that now in future crop production systems. I engage a lot with external partners, groups like Fairchild Gardens, but also we talk with a lot of companies doing things that could help to meet some of our challenges. We've been talking a lot with folks in the controlled environment ag industry. We talk a lot with folks in the biostimulants industry, looking at, engineered microbiomes to help promote plant growth and protect the plants. I'll talk with LED lighting manufacturers or watering people. So I talk with everybody. I also engage internally. I work closely, as I said, with the fluid physics community, but also with the food science group at Johnson Space Center, the advanced environmental health group looking at microbial monitoring, behavioral health and psychology. So I work a lot with other groups to try to pull things together and build bridges. And then I work also with the stakeholders, so the funding groups who are helping to fund our research, because it's not all coming through space biology. We have the Human Research Program that helps fund some of our work. We have the Advanced Exploration Systems Program. And so all of these are different kind of groups within NASA that don't necessarily talk to each other. So I help to ensure communications, and I support my colleagues who are also doing that. And then we do have a lot of reports to management. Every month we meet with our space biology management and the status of the different flight experiments, the different grants, et cetera. I do a lot of mentoring with my job. So we have interns every semester in the area of space crop production, undergraduate and graduate interns. So these are things to consider if you're ever interested in doing this type of work. We've been virtual for a while, but we hope to get back into in-person internships. And we also have NASA postdocs through the NASA postdoctoral program. And then I have some graduate fellows that I work with through the NASA Space Technology Graduate Research Fellowship Program, which funds both master's and PhD students who are working in space technologies. They also will come as part of their program as a visiting technologist. And I also work with student groups. So I work with a lot of engineering design student groups at a variety of different universities doing things like CubeSats or plant watering systems or other challenges that we or they come up with. And I support a lot of different engagement and outreach activities like those and the ones I've talked about and others. So that is pretty much it, but I just want to mention it. Really, my job is all about communication and teamwork. I think those are the most important skills that you can gain as a graduate student. And, you know, obviously there's a lot of people involved, a lot of thanks, but these are the main funding sources and the main groups that I work with. And here's a picture of Scott Kelly's bouquet. So now I will stop sharing and open it up to questions.
Thank you for the lovely talk, Dr. Massa. So if anyone would like to ask a question, just unmute yourself and go ahead.
What did you find was the most helpful for you when it came to trying to find postdocs or jobs after your PhD? Was it more so the networking at conferences, or was it more so like crazy random happenstance, or was it more so like your mentor's connections?
So personally, it was conferences. You know, I met Carrie Mitchell at the ASGSB, which is American Society for Gravitational and Space Biology, which I started going to as a graduate student. You know, we got to talking. He was interested in what I was doing, you know, and then I shared, you know, that I really wasn't, you know, cut out for being a cell biologist. It just wasn't my happy place. I talked with him about my background, and then when he had an opportunity as a postdoc, you know, he thought of me first. So I think for me that was personally the biggest thing. And then, you know, my postdoc as NASA came when I was part of the center at Purdue, and we had you know, it was just networking with our NASA colleagues through that center and through other conferences. I got involved in the Controlled Environment Agriculture conference there. And I think it was actually at that conference when Ray Wheeler said, hey, we're going to have a postdoc working on Veggie. Would you be interested? So for me, it was really the face-to-face and then the networking and just, you know, expressing my interest to people, but also, you know, showing up and doing good things. I mean, I gave poster presentations at these conferences. You can't just expect them to come find you, you know? And so I think even though I'm kind of an introvert and it's not my comfort zone, you got to get yourself out there, you know, present your work at any opportunity. And then people do notice it and go, wow, this is interesting, or hey, this person's doing something that might fit in well with what I'm doing. But yeah, I think, you know, if you're interested in a certain area, I also, you know, recommend to students that I work with, contact people working in that area, you know, build a relationship with them. I always kind of thought as a grad student in, you know, as an undergrad, well, if I'm just excellent at what I do, you know, people will find me. But it's really not about that. It's about who you know, and it's about building these relationships, you know, expressing interest in their work, finding out about their work, asking intelligent questions. You know, when you see if it's a field that you're interested in and you see announcements of grants that are being awarded by NASA or USDA or NSF or whatever organization, look at who's getting those grants, contact them, go, wow, this is really interesting. Can I learn more about what you're doing? And just start to build that relationship. And I think that really serves you in good stead.
We have a few more questions in the chat. What are the main observed differences in the shape and physiology of the plants grown in space versus those grown on Earth? And what was the polymer for the seed film?
Yeah, so I'll answer the polymer one first. So that is actually the same thing in Listerine breath strips. It's called Polylin. My colleague, who was a polymer chemist, was also involved in he was the Veggie project manager. He helped develop that, and he looked at all the different properties of different food safe water soluble polymers, and that one was very dry and very stable, and so that's why he selected that one. The main differences, it's if we can get the environment similar, there really aren't too many differences. It's just getting the environment similar, and ventilation, airflow, ventilation, and then irrigation seem to be the major factors. Otherwise, we will see differences in shape. We'll see some stress responses in the plants, growing in the space environment, but they're usually pretty similar to stress responses you might see from drought or flood or poor airflow on Earth. So I know there's a lot of differential genes expressed between space and ground, but in general, in crop plants, when you're growing for a longer duration, there really aren't that many differences. We do see differences in the microbiome, in that community structure, because we're enclosed in a very different environment up there and exposed to a lot more things that are floating in the air and that don't settle in the same way. But in general, plants can grow pretty similarly as long as we can get all the engineering working pretty well, which is a big challenge.
Plants are pretty flexible.
Yes.
What's one piece of advice you'd like to give yourself now before starting to work at NASA?
Oh, that's a really good question. I was never great at writing all my work up. It's always been one of the hardest things for me. I actually really like writing proposals. I don't like writing papers. I like speaking, which is kind of weird for an introvert, but I've always liked public speaking. And so, I think just being a really good communicator and asking questions and being a team player, I think, is probably the best advice I could give for anybody coming into this job. It's all really about communication. I still have papers that I need to write up, but now I have a team that also helps write everything up, which is really great. I'm much better at editing other people's work than coming up with it originally. But yeah, I think just doing team projects and being a team player. Also, one thing I didn't expect was all the meetings. There's a lot more meetings than I ever kind of really anticipated. And for me, this has been a very draining thing. I've learned a lot more about introverts and extroverts. And one of the things that I learned is for me as an introvert, being around people, talking to people, having people come and interrupt me all day long, it's not that I don't like it, it's just that it drains the energy out of me. Whereas I have to go off by myself and read a book to recharge. Whereas for extroverts, they get energy from that situation. So I think learning about your personality and the environment that you work well in is another really good thing to think about when you're thinking about any job. For me, I like the fact that it's different every day, but it is kind of exhausting and kind of stressful, but I also kind of thrive on that. I don't think I knew that going into it. I thought, I'll be just doing plant science, but no, it's just like constantly changing and you get whiplash. And I'm glad that I like that, but I do find it pretty tiring. I don't have nearly as much creativity and creative energy as I had before taking this job. So I think just being aware of what you're getting yourself into, and anytime you can shadow or learn more about a job before you accept it, I think is really good advice.
Great. Another interesting question: is computational plant biology a potential new field / opportunity that NASA may be looking for?
So I'm not entirely sure what that means, Eliana. I know we do have bioinformatics, but yeah, please go ahead and tell me more about what you mean by that.
Well, I guess just integrating like programming and plant biology. I don't know how exactly it would fit in because it's kind of like, I guess, an emerging field, but I was wondering if that's something that NASA's looking for. Yeah.
You know, I think it certainly could. There's a lot of things that we don't really know that we need yet. And, you know, thinking about crop systems of the future, especially like talking plants, you know, or having plant systems that can detect when there's stress before it becomes growth limiting, before it becomes, you know, problematic and impactful, and so that you can correct it. I think that's one area that maybe could overlap. You know, we're doing a lot of work with AI, automation, remote sensing, things like hyperspectral, multispectral imaging. But I think we can also do a lot from the plant side in terms of developing plants that are suitable for this environment. We do have some grants and some academic institutions that are working on, you know, the development of custom space plants. And so I think in that area, there's certainly be a lot of room for looking into these things.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks.
We also have a question from Lily. She loved your talk. What's your favorite aspect of your research? You mentioned how you went through a lot of faculty interviews. How did you deal with that? And finally, you mentioned how one of your experiments had a lot of things go wrong, which is making Lily feel a lot better about her own experiments.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I should tell you guys that when I was at Penn State in grad school, I had about 16 different PhD projects before I settled on one that worked. So I sort of glossed over that. But yeah, I mean, it's biology, right? So it does whatever the heck it wants, and you sort of play catch up a lot. The favorite aspect of my research, I think it's really the interdisciplinary stuff. I think it's working with a lot of these different groups and pulling together these different pieces, you know, that you didn't even know really exist when you're just in one field. And so it's this constant learning from new fields. I've realized that I'm not really a specialist. I'm much more a generalist, and I'm happy in that. It took me a long time to kind of come to terms with that, because I think when you're in graduate school, when you're doing postdocs, you know, you get very deep in specific fields, and you get asked by your committee these really deep, in-depth, you know, processes, questions. So you have to know all this stuff, right? But I don't know all this stuff. I mean, if I need to know it, I can look it up. And I work with faculty who know all this stuff, and they're brilliant and they're amazing, but my mind just doesn't work that way. I like knowing a lot of different things, and I only know a little bit about it, but I know enough that I can start to pull those pieces together, and I can talk somewhat intelligently with fluid physics or with food science or with behavioral health or with, you know, electrical engineers about LED lighting, or, you know, crop physiologists. But I don't know a lot about any of those fields, but I know more than, you know, most electrical engineers about food science, you know. So I'm, rather than the detailed information person, I like being the conduit. I like being able to make these connections. And so for me, realizing that that's also a really important aspect of science, and that you don't have to go super down into the weeds to be smart and to be successful and to do something meaningful. That was kind of a revelation to me. And, you know, I still sometimes feel like, oh my gosh, I'm a bad scientist, you know, because I'm not publishing a lot. I'm not making breakthroughs at the key point of, you know, some sort of physiological cycle or whatever. But at the same time, I'm helping grow food for astronauts, and that's really pretty cool. And so even though classically it may not be the definition of really, you know, really good fundamental science, I'm okay with that. So I think figuring out that was a big deal for me. And that is really my favorite aspect, is building those bridges, making those connections, and pulling in unique fields that you may never have thought could impact plant physiology, because it's all important to help our challenges. Yeah, the interviews, it was interesting. I wouldn't say it was a lot, but I had had several. This was during the recession, as I said, and so there were jobs that like they would appear, they would actually interview, or phone interview, or on-site interview, and then all of a sudden the job would disappear. So it wasn't like that I even didn't get the job. In some cases, it was that the jobs were canceled because the people who had planned to retire couldn't retire because their retirement accounts were wiped out or whatever. I did have a faculty position that I accepted in Hawaii, which was very cool, but it ended up kind of falling through, and that was really stressful and frustrating. It was just, there was a lot of poor communication and a lot of nothing in writing, and that for me was difficult. And then I realized I probably wouldn't do well in that environment if that was kind of the norm. The interviews were great. I actually really liked the interviews. I loved meeting people and learning about what they were doing and trying to think of creative ways that what I was interested in could fit in with what they were doing. The corporate interview, not so much. I only had one of those, and I realized, yeah, it really wasn't. When they asked me what was like my dream job, I'm like, I want to work at Kennedy Space Center, and they were like, oh, okay. So that job I definitely did not get, and I think we all knew that. So yeah, it was a great learning experience. I think doing the interviews, just like doing interviews for grad school, it's really good. You learn a lot. You learn what you do like, what you don't like, where you fit, where you feel yourself being comfortable, and where you can imagine yourself working. So yeah, I would encourage you to just apply for things, try it out, and also look like USA Jobs is really interesting, right? Because when I was kind of finishing up at Penn State, I realized, yeah, I don't want to do this. I don't want to stare down a microscope in a dark room. So I started looking at what other jobs were out there before the postdoc turned up the opportunity. And, there were some fascinating jobs as biologists on like naval stations, assessing different flora and fauna, or as horticulturalists for me on the plant side in different areas, or working in, say, APHIS, where you're looking at invasive species or making sure that biology is not coming in through airports that could get out and escape. Like, there's some really interesting jobs for biologists that never tell us about in grad school. So I would just look around, see what's out there, and do, spread your searches a little wider. But USA Jobs is kind of fun to set up a search on. So.
Thank you very much for answering all our questions and for a wonderful presentation. So if there's no other questions, I'd like to thank everyone for coming, especially Dr. Massa. And please keep an eye out for our emails, everyone, and find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We're just at HGSAC. And our next career seminar will be on February 9th with Dr. Saria. So thank you everyone for coming, and everyone have a good day.
Thank you.
Applause for Dr. Massa.
Thank you.